So this is M60, causes of declining biodiversity. So basically, humans are causing a lot of decline in biodiversity. So just by removing habitat for building, lumber, development, that has the biggest toll on this decline of the species. And that's a big cause of it. So looking at the land that we use for everything, we're separating species, especially migratory species, and that's really the biggest factor of the species diversity. So up here on the right, what's kind of surprising and kind of interesting and nice to know is that forested lands in the U.S. are increasing. So that's great, but you have to think of, are they diverse? So is there biodiversity in those forests? Probably not. So if you think about after a wildfire, for example, or even logging, a lot of times what we do is we go in and we replant, but we replant maybe all of the same tree. We're not planting a diverse successional forest. And so that can definitely be an issue, especially when you think about, 100 years later, a disease breaks out or something happens, and now you've got just one species. So now you've got a really non-resilient forest. So the forests coming back are great, but they're not old growth forests. They're not a mixed variety of species. They're mostly the same species. So in the U.S. and Europe, forested lands are coming back and increasing. But in developing nations, the opposite is true. So their forested lands are dwindling, especially the rainforest. We're cutting down approximately a football field a day of forest, and that's a small estimate. Some people estimate it to be a lot more. So it's pretty significant, especially when the last section we talked about how they are storing carbon and kind of offsetting our carbon usage. So that's really making a big impact on our climate. And if we move down to here, this talks about our habitats. So 50% of grassland habitats have diminished, 30% of desert habitats, and then in California alone, 90% of wetlands are lost. And a lot of this has to do with urban sprawl and our usage of the land. But some of it has to do with ocean levels rising, and devastating storms that hurt, the wetlands and things like that. So some of it has to do with that, but a lot of it is human, negligence, basically. So moving on to this side, it looks at, this kind of goes back to the last module, when I talked about how climate is shifting. But the forests might not necessarily be shifting at the same speed or can shift, especially in mountainous regions. They can't just move from one mountainous region to the other. So that's one of the reasons why our conifers are dwindling and endangered. But this shows tree loss, tree gain, tree cover. So you can see where it's green, trees are replenishing. But then you can also see there's quite a bit of red on there, which is the tree loss. So definitely disturbing. And then what is causing a decline in coral? So there's numerous things that are causing a decline in coral. Some is harvesting coral for exotic species, for aquariums, and things like that. And some of it is basic just acidity in the ocean, shifting temperatures in the ocean, causing bleaching. And coral is, it provides a shelter for hundreds of species. And so coral is extremely important habitat for a lot of ecosystems in the ocean. So it's really kind of a big indicator of things aren't right in the ocean. So read about what is causing the decline. So there's more to it than just what I said. And then if we look at small habitats in protected areas, basically if we have a small habitat, it decreases the migratory patterns of some species, especially species that have really big migratory patterns. So think about like a panther, for example, mountain lion. They can have a range up to 100 miles for one mountain lion. And so if we cut off their area, then we may cut off their access to breeding grounds, and then now we have another bottleneck effect. So that can, and the same goes for wolves or any kind of large predatory animal tends to have a really large habitat. So these small little protected areas, having a real small protected area isn't as good as having a real large habitat, like a real large, vast area for them. So it really decreases their genetic diversity if you have a really small area. And then it can also increase the interaction of harmful species. So in the book, it talks a little bit about birds that live on the outskirts of dwindling forests and what happens to their eggs and them as a species. So make sure you read about that. And then know the difference between these things. So native species, alien species, and alien species are also called exotic species. So they kind of are the same thing, just two different words. So native species is something that lives in the area, has lived in the area for a very long time, is kind of endemic to that area. But alien or exotic species are introduced. So they could be introduced by man intentionally. So sometimes we introduce species to combat an issue like excess algae growth, or maybe a species we want to minimize. So maybe some type of species that harms maybe crops or something. Or it can be accidentally. So they can, like rats, for example, can live on ships, jump off when the ship docks, and now they're an invasive species. And so what an invasive species is when an exotic species, so something that's introduced intentionally or unintentionally, it becomes, it multiplies and it likes the environment and is able to thrive there. And a lot of times it doesn't have any predators. So for example, when I did a science research trip to Honduras a few years ago, we studied in the marine section of it, we studied the lionfish. And so the lionfish in the Caribbean is an invasive species. So people have them in their aquariums. They get too big. They're really territorial, so they'll kill all the fish around them in the aquarium. And then they also damage coral. And so that's pretty much the last thing you want in your aquarium. They look cool, but that's about it. And so people decided, well, I don't want this anymore. It's from the ocean. I'm just going to put it in the ocean. And what happened, though, in the Caribbean is that these lionfish are kind of endemic to Australia, to Indonesia area, not to the Caribbean. And so now it's become a huge problem because there's no species to keep them in check. So they are the top predator, and they are just demolishing some of the coral reefs that are around there. And so we actually hunted them. We actually went out and speared them and got to taste them and everything, but they are trying to eradicate them. So that's what an invasive species is just an exotic species that really takes hold and basically takes over and can cause other species to become extinct, or at least do a lot of damage to them. And then there are invasive species, the top 3 in the U.S. We're going to go over some in California in class. But invasive species in the U.S., the top 3 are the zebra mussel, which is also in California. So if you have a boat, you probably have a sticker on your boat that says it is zebra mussel free. And they always ask you when you move your boat to certain areas if you've been checked for zebra mussels. If you always have your boat here, they won't ask you. But if you move it across state, they definitely ask you. And then the silver carp and the kudzu vine. And so basically these are invasive species that were introduced to serve a purpose. And now they're kind of taking over. And now we understand a lot more about environmental science. But, before we saw it as a quick fix to a problem, but didn't understand kind of the invasive quality that they would become. So I want you to read about how were they introduced. So the details about how they were introduced. So most of them were introduced on purpose. The zebra mussel, not necessarily, but the number 2 and 3, of course, they were. But also, what effects are they having? So what are they doing to the environment? And what was their first purpose? And then now what is happening with them becoming really invasive? And then these are animals that have become extinct. Some of the top ones, top six, from humans. Pretty significant. It's mainly over harvesting. So we eat these animals, we use them. They weren't really, afraid of humans. They weren't really around humans, didn't evolve to be around humans. And so they were easy to catch or to prey on. And so they became extinct from overharvesting, which is always sad. And then this last part, why is it illegal? Why is illegal harvesting still a problem, even with the Lacey Act and the CDs? So these are two acts that were put in place, and they're actually right over here. So the Lacey Act prohibits all interstate shipping of illegally harvested plants or animals. So you can't go if you have something that, let's say that you buy something on the internet or something. And so if you buy it from one state, you're not allowed to ship it to another state if it's illegally harvested. And it could be animals or plants. And then the CDs is basically just looks at a list that the IUCN manages called a red list. And that red list is a list of animals that are endangered, that should not be hunted or traded or used in any way. And so then the CDs uses it to control the trade. So, for example, rhino tusks, elephant tusks, those things are extremely valuable, and people want to trade them, but they're on this list because those animals are extremely endangered. So they manage that. And in the U.S., who manages that is the Fish and Wildlife. Regulates that red list and what can be brought into the country and traded or are purchased. And so if we look at this, though, there's a lot of stuff that is still traded. So on CNN News, they talk often about illegal poaching because things are worth a lot of money. And so people are willing to go get these things and sell them or trade them for a lot of money. And they may or may not understand the environmental consequences. Oftentimes, I think they don't understand the environmental consequences. But anyway, so they can be, harvested or poached to the brink of extinction, which is something we want to try to avoid. And that's what these two laws try to curb that behavior. And that is it for M60.